A big topic in today's landscape is who's paying for campaigns and those fancy mailers and ads you see. We're lucky to have the associate editor of the Arizona Mirror, Jeremy Duda, to help break this down and give voters like you help understanding what to expect in 2020. Jeremy,
all right, well, thank you all for coming. So it seems like we just had an election, but the next one is just around the corner, which means that your mailboxes are all going to soon be flooded with mail pieces. There's going to be signs on every intersection. You'll be seeing campaign ads on Facebook, and especially you'll be seeing a lot of ads on television. And at the bottom of all those ads, or at the end of those commercials, you're going to see or hear a little notification. So this ad paid for by whoever, possibly, it might say not endorsed by this candidate or not associated with your campaign. But that doesn't really tell you a lot. It tells you kind of who the committee is or who the campaign is that's done these ads. It doesn't really tell you a lot about where that money is actually coming from. So what I'm going to be doing here today is kind of helping you all kind of walk you through how to find who's actually paying for all these ads that you see. First, I'm kind of interested to know who here has really spent much time looking up campaign finance information online. Secretary of State's website, FEC. Okay. So, something that occupies a lot of my time as a political journalist at the Arizona Mirror. So this might be this won't be news to all of you, but it sounds like most of you, a lot of you don't have a lot of experience doing that. Just to start, I kind of want to give a rundown of how we got where we are in the campaign finance landscape here in Arizona. First off, can everyone hear me all right? Do I need to speak into the microphone? Okay. All right. It's kind of how we got here. Up until 1986, Arizona was very much the Wild West. We had no campaign contribution limits in this state. We did have disclosure. You could give whatever you wanted. The campaign could accept whatever they wanted, but you had to disclose where you were getting your money. In 1986, voters approved the first contribution limits, and up through about 2013, we had some of the lowest limits in the country, actually. That year, the legislature dramatically increased the limits. A few allies of our current governor, Doug Duda, went to the legislature, said this would be a good idea. You'd be surprised to know who the biggest beneficiary of that was in the 2014 elections. And so now our contribution limits are $5,200 to a candidate for state office and about $6,450 for other offices. There's a quirk in the law, so for city, county elections, the limit's actually a little bit higher. But $5,200 is what you can give to a candidate. Now, just a brief rundown. Of course, you've probably heard somewhat about this because of who's hosting this event. You also have the Clean Elections Act, so you don't actually have to take money from private individuals, from PACs, from anything like that. You can collect $5 contributions, and the Clean Elections Commission will give you a lump sum of funding for your campaign. Now, real quick, the federal level, FEC, congressmen, senators, president, limits are slightly different. It's $5,600 for the election, although technically they consider the primary and the general separate elections. So you can actually have $2,800 per election. You can give a candidate $5,600. They can't, if they have a primary, they can't use it all in that primary. Then, of course, you get to the folks where there are no limits. You have mostly super PACs. These, when you get to campaign finance, this is where things start getting complicated. Especially when you get to, how many here have heard of dark money? I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. See my allies from the fourth estate here, of course. Dark money, this can be corporations, LLCs. Mostly what you see is nonprofits, 501c4 organizations. Now, these folks do not have to disclose where their money comes from. Usually, they have to disclose what they're spending, who they're spending it for. Even that gets kind of hard to track sometimes. You can at least see that. What you can't see in most places is where that money is coming from. So to start, we'll start with the state level campaigns. You have to go to different places to find campaign contribution information for different campaigns. How many folks here have been to this website and used that before? All right, this really is if you wanted to see who's running for statewide office, governor, attorney general, secretary of state, who's running for the legislature. This is where you'll go. This is your first stop. And there's a couple different places you can go. This is the one I usually do. This is the old website. They have two different versions here. The most simple way is you go here and find the election year you want. The default setting will be for the current election cycle we're in. You can scroll down. Now, once reports start coming in, the candidate, they don't actually have to report their first, they don't have to file their first contribution report until, I think, the end of January. So most of these folks aren't showing a lot of activity right now. But you can go back and look at what their previous, for all the incumbents, they all have reports from prior years. So you can go to, pull up one example here. It's kind of a clunky website, but once you get used to using it, and it's easy way, you can look up each of their reports. Okay, there's not a lot of activity. This one may not be a good example, but you can go and see. They'll be categorized by who's giving them money, individuals, political action committees, and then where all the disbursements are going. Sections for maybe loans that are outstanding. You can see how much they've given themselves, because that's the one thing where there's unlimited contributions to a candidate committee is if you are self-funding, you, your family, your parents, your spouse, your kids, unlimited amounts of money. So you see a lot of rich folks writing some pretty big checks. You'll see that all here. The only problem can be the reporting periods. As I mentioned, you have an entire year during the year before the election where there are no reports due for candidates. So they could be doing a lot of different things. Now, another thing you can do here, suppose you want to track who is giving money, not necessarily what an individual committee is giving, but who is giving money. So, right here in the search type, for the contributors, look up, we'll go with an easy one. So, someone who writes a lot of checks. You can see this person's given to, that's a political action committee called Arizona for Strong Leadership. The governor's a political action committee, if I'm not mistaken. Let's try previous year. See, here we have a lot more. You click on each one of these and you can see what each of these checks are going towards. Political party, attorney general. Then you get, I mentioned before, the super PACs, the independent expenditure committees, the outside groups. This is where probably the biggest money you're going to see spent in the election next year is. And there's several different kind of committees. Most of these aren't actually relevant anymore because there's been changes to campaign finance law from a few years ago. So independent expenditure, that's not really something to look at anymore. So what you want to look at here mostly is the PACs. Pretty much anything that's not a political party or a candidate is designated as a political action committee. And they have to report even in the off year. So just scrolling down, you can see who's really got a lot of money here. But if you want to we'll go to that committee we were looking at just a minute ago. And here you can look up the year's worth of reports. Now, if you know exactly what you're looking for a particular committee, at least in my experience, is a fairly easy way to do it. But the Secretary of State does have another website. And sorry, if I drift away from the microphone, please let me know. This is the See the Money. It's a separate site by the Secretary of State's office. And that's where you can start to do things like more easily, if you want to see who all is giving a particular company money, where people are spending it. Which is one thing you can't do with the old website. You can look each individual report and say who's giving to this consulting firm, who's paying this vendor. you have to go basically report by report to find that and see the money. In some ways, and I think it probably is. I'm stubborn, so I'm still mostly using the old website, but there are times when I'll go to this, and mainly what I'll use it for is if I'm interested to see who's paying, primary consultants. We'll use that as an example since you're here. So you search and see how many folks have who all has made expenditures to Paul's company. Now, just this drop-down list, one of the reasons I still probably haven't warmed to this is it's still, you see a giant list, you don't necessarily know who all these expenditures are. But you click on them, and it will theoretically bring up the information. Okay, well. Actually, I think I know what the problem is here. You might be using the wrong year. So, let me switch over to the federal system here real quick, because this is a lot more, you can get a lot more detailed on this. This is, I think, probably a lot easier to use. You can search candidates, committees. Here you can see raising and spending. So you can start with the candidate if you want to look up an individual person. And so this is pretty easy. You're just going to put in the name, Martha McSally, for example, someone whose name you're going to be hearing a lot during next year's elections. And you're going to want to click on the committee. All the campaign information is mostly going to be tied to the committee, not to the candidate. But the candidate, you pull them up and they'll show you which political committees they have. From there, we'll go down to filings here. And that's where you see all the campaign finance reports. So if you want to look at the most recent one, it's a lot of money on that one, so it's taking a little while to load. But if you're a little more tech savvy, you can also download some of the more detailed information. And me, I usually go for the old-fashioned PDF, which is still search friendly. Now that's basically the same thing you can do with the Secretary of State's website, but going back to what I was talking about before, if you want to search by who's paying each particular vendor, you can go to spending. That will give you the same option for search, except you can search by usually if it's in the system, it will show you. We'll drop down. So, or that's the spender. Sorry. So we want to search by recipient. So see there, you pull up the consult if you want to see who's paying a particular consulting firm, for example, a pollster, an ad vendor, something like that. You put it into the recipient name, and that'll show you everyone. Here you have one recipient for that particular year, and remember you will have to kind of set which year you're talking about, which election cycle. But this gives you that option. So if you want to search 2017 to 2018, you can search as many or as few as you want. You can search for who all, just in Arizona. If someone does a lot of national, you have a lot of big national pollsters, consulting firms, people like that, doing business with campaigns all over the country. You can filter it down by state. think in some cases you might even be able to filter by a particular congressional district. You can do the same thing for contributions. And one thing that the FEC does, and this is much easier on the FEC than is on the state website. I mentioned dark money, super PACs, independent expenditures. When you start getting closer to a campaign, you start to see a lot more of those ads, and they don't have to report in some cases for a month, a couple of weeks, maybe longer. But on the federal level, they're required within 24 or 48 hours, depending on how close they are to election. Every time these people spend money, they have to file a report, and that will start showing up more quickly. At the state level, the Clean Elections Commission still requires this. Sometimes they're on the Secretary of State's website, sometimes they're on the Clean Elections website. It's gone back and forth over the years due to some disagreements over statutory enforcement authority. I think it'll be on the Secretary of State's website in the next election cycle, but I'm not entirely sure, so I can't give an example of that. But what you can show here is you can actually search by independent expenditure committees. You can search by candidates, and it will show you, like I pulled up Martha McSally's page before, it will show you who all is spending to help that committee. And it'll give you each of these 48-hour or 24-hour or 48-hour reports. So let me... on the line item, it usually will. And sometimes it's an aggregate amount. If you want to get into more detail, you can pull up the individual. So it might be, a different amount. And if it's a Senate campaign, a statewide campaign, it might show this much in this metro to this vendor because it's a different metro area, this much on this particular ad buy. But yeah, you can look all the way. If you don't want to get into the more the detailed amount on the actual reports, you can see each individual amounts. And there should be a place where, say, 24 and 48-hour reports, you can see who the spender is, you can see who the candidate mentioned. And that's, unless if you're looking for a particular committee, search for that. But usually you might want to see who all is spending for Martha McSally or Kirsten Sinema or Mark Kelly, some of these big ticket races. You can see who's all spending money just in the state, or you can go to the candidate there. I'll give you the option, see what it'll, if they're in the system, it'll drop down. You can search by year. So 1,261 results. That was a pretty big dollar race. Search by amount. Some of those dollar numbers were pretty small. Here's the big ones. From there, you can click on that particular committee, for example. You can look up their individual reports at that point if you want, or you can go back and use those 24-hour, 48-hour reports. Another way, if you don't want to wait for the reports to come in, or if it's a candidate committee that maybe doesn't have to do those trigger reports, as they're called, you can actually go to the FCC. Their website allows you to search ad expenditures by every candidate, every committee. If you're spending money in an election, you have to report it to the FCC. And for this, you generally search by media organization. So for example, KPNX, Channel 12. From there. So for the basic information, and on this page, what you're going to be looking for is political files, the little kind of shield with the star in it. So see, there's the number of files reported. So nothing reported for this cycle yet, but back to 2018, you can break down federal, state, Non-candidate issue ads. A lot of the time, that's where these dark money groups, the ones who don't have to report where they're getting their money, they still have to report that they're spending, even if not reporting to election officials like the FEC or the Secretary of State's office. This still has to go up on the FCC's website, and there you can see. Okay. So. So there's a lot of numbers. Most of this you can ignore. What you want to look for generally is somewhere near the top or at the bottom itemized. They'll have the total amount that they're spending. Some will show how much they're showing in a metro area. They'll say on channel 15 we're spending $60,000, for ads on for this person for this week. But then it'll also show that's part of a $250,000 buy for the entire metro area on broadcast television. So the rules aren't extremely standardized. Some networks do it, some don't. Channel 15 and Channel 12, I think, for example, if you're trying to find them in the Phoenix metro area, those are usually the ones I'll look for that have the larger amounts. Because we have two media markets here in Arizona, Phoenix and Tucson. Most of the spending is going to be in the Phoenix area. And now there's also the opensecrets.org. They aggregate a lot of this information from the FCC's website. So and I'm a bit less experienced in using this one, but it could not possibly be less clunky than the FCC's website. Don't make it easy, the information is there. And I think I actually accidentally closed that FCC one. Now that will show you, so the website I showed you so far, these will show you who is spending money and how much they're spending. But what a lot of people want to know is where that money is originally coming from. And unfortunately, for a lot of these super PACs, that's not an option. You can find out, but there is still some information that you can find out about these people. You can look up, if it's an established group, you can go, there's a lot of websites where you can go to look at their 990s, their annual tax forms that nonprofits have to file. Now, this one is called candid.org. I usually use GuideStar or Foundation Center. I forgot my login information for them, but you can get free accounts with most of these. And you can look up GuideStar. That's one, GuideStar.org. Foundation Center is one. It's pretty easy to use. They all have more premium versions you can use, but they also have free ones if you want to get kind of the basic information. Now, these folks have to report. The one thing they do have to report is they don't have to say who's giving them money, but they do have to say other nonprofits they're giving money to. And that can be useful because these nonprofit groups, the C4s, the dark money groups, it's kind of like Russian dolls. I'm not trying to imply anything, but link that to anything going on in the news right now, but what you'll often see is money kind of getting moved, laundered, if you will, from one group to the next. And that can make it extremely difficult. Now, you get these 990s and you can see who they're reporting giving money to. There's one big problem with that. It might take you a year and a half to figure that out. They file these once a year, and even that's only limited. But what you can also find out from this is whose name is on it, where is it based, that might be able to tell you something. This is a 990 for a group called American Encore. It's a very, very well-known dark money group based here in Arizona, and very active in Arizona. If you didn't know who they were, you can look them up and find the name of the officers on here. See, and I'll use this guy as an example. Sean Noble is a local political consultant, local operative. He's been tied to a lot of these groups. If you didn't know who they were, you could at least pull this up, this 990, and see whose name is listed as a president. Say, okay, that gives me somewhat of an idea of a prominent Republican who's tied to this person, who's tied to that person. Another thing you can do to look up find out what some of these groups are doing is sounds very basic, but you can at least do a Google search for them in the news, find out where else they've been active. Some of these groups are, just because they're spending in one state doesn't mean they're based there. Some of the most prolific groups in previous elections have been based out of South Dakota and Iowa, spending for Arizona gubernatorial candidates. We just had some city elections out here where it was an Oklahoma City-based group, I think, that everyone was kind of wondering why they were involved in an election here in the city of Phoenix. And I don't think they actually had any spending in other places. But a lot of the times, people will use these pre-existing groups, and you can see patterns, see what kinds of candidates, what party, what kinds of issues they're involved in. Other groups, other kinds of federal groups. You may have heard of what's it called, a 527 group, and some political committees are organized this way. Go search for IRS political committee search, and sometimes people will form exploratory committees. This isn't necessary, but federal candidates who are getting ready to launch campaigns or considering it will file exploratory committees. They still have to report where their money's coming from and where it's going. You can search for them. Usually they'll be organized this way. Some groups, the Republican and Democratic Attorneys General Association. These are some pretty big national organizations that spend in AG's races across the states. They're all organized as 527s. Can't remember if they're listed that way or just under their acronym. But they'll have full reports. The same thing you see on the FEC or the Secretary of State's website. This is where you'll find those. A lot of times, a lot of news articles come out of these reports. Just, when you get to these reporting deadlines, Oh yeah, I mean, as a journalist, yes, all the time. Yeah, pretty frequent. This is a pretty frequent source of information you want to see. Especially when you see the money race. I mean, this is, and it seems like insider baseball, but this is a very important part of campaigns.
And do you find that they switch frequently, like their facts and names and stuff like that, or do they basically stay the same over time?
What do you mean, switch?
File or as a fact. Do you find that they use new facts like every cycle?
Sometimes you'll find some very long the dark money ones kind of depends, because theoretically the rules for these groups, since Citizens United is like a corporation or a nonprofit, you can spend money in elections. That is your First Amendment right. But your primary purpose cannot be spending in elections. Otherwise, you're legally considered a campaign committee or a political action committee, and that means you have to start filing these full reports. People who are spending this way don't usually want to file those reports because the point of it is to be able to disguise where the money is coming from. So a lot of the times these groups are pre-existing. You want someone who has a history of spending in things besides elections. The rule of thumb is usually, more than 50% at the bare minimum. 51% has to be for other expenditures, and that can be for a lot of things that still have a political nexus, lobbying, issue advocacy campaigns. Do you guys know what that means? These are when you see an ad that's not telling you to vote for or against someone. They say, call your congressman and tell them you want them to vote yes on, House bill, whatever. Tell them you want them to repeal Obamacare. Tell them this. A lot of times these are generally intended to move the needle on issues, to get people to put pressure on their elected officials. A lot of times they're kind of campaign ads in disguise. Put them near elections, but if it's not a campaign spending, that would, for example, count as non-election spending, or lobbying, another thing that would not count as election spending. Some of these groups are extremely political in nature, and most of their spending is still political, but the majority, at least, is not for campaigns, and that allows them to maintain that nonprofit status, not get in trouble with that. A couple other places to look for ads. Something that's very much more common these days, Facebook. Now, people are watching TV less and less, but everyone's spending time online. Everyone's looking at Facebook, and you constantly see those ads. You can target these very narrowly. You can figure out what types of profiles you want this to go to. People in a certain area, people of a certain age, people of a certain political party, And this Facebook ad library, this will allow you to search who all is running ads in your particular area. I'm gonna go, since I don't mean to pick on Martha McSally, it's a distinctive name that will pop up so you can see who's running ads on Facebook. These are all inactive. These are all, this is a Facebook ads library, and I can put up the original link if anyone wants here. Basically, if you just Google Facebook ad library, it'll bring you to this website. And that the amounts aren't extremely precise. It'll generally give you a range of they're spending between this much and this much. But you can see what the ad is. You can see who's paying for it. They have to disclose that. You can see how long it was up for. Unfortunately, you can't see some of the more granular information, such as who's being targeted. But you can at least see who's running ads. You can see Martha McSally, for example, is running ads on impeachment. Yeah, I think the Facebook ad library, I just learned about that during the last election cycle. I don't.
It was May 28th.
Okay. So it'll bring you straight to the ads. Twitter, I think that's probably less prevalent. I mean, obviously still sponsored ads on Twitter, but you can do the same thing. It's a much easier URL if anyone wants to write that down. You can say the same thing. What are the ads they're running? When did they run? When did they pop up in people's news feeds? I'm sorry? Yeah. It'll say, if it's an IE, if it's a super PAC, yeah, and then obviously you wouldn't be able, or at least if it's a nonprofit or a corporation, if it's a super PAC that has to file committees, you can go to their reports and that you can see how much they're spending, but this is much timelier. But even if it's a dark money group, I think they would probably still have to be reporting the fact that they're putting these ads up. You'd still be able to find the ads even if you can't find out who is behind it. I guess, does anyone have any questions about it? There's a lot of stuff I've tried to go over in a very short amount of time, but anyone have any questions about how to find the information they're looking for, where to look?
So do we get to see individual donors in any of these links that we donors?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you want to look up individual, are you looking for individual donors to a particular committee or a particular candidate, or just so if you want to look up any candidate, for example, on the state level, you go back to the Secretary of State's website and actually I'm going to use the last election cycle since all those reports are in. You can see, for example, you can look up each individual report, and that'll have a detailed list of every contributor, how much they've given, how much they gave on that report, how much they give in total. So if you gave $100 to a candidate in February, and then the next quarter you gave them another $250, that'll actually show up in the report. It'll say $100 for this particular amount, but then 350 cumulatively. Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, we have to wait. People like us, the campaign finance nerds, have to wait a long time during the off years to get this information. But if you wanted to find, you can search by the candidate. But then, as I showed before, you can also search by the donor. So if you see a contributor say, "Oh, I see this person gave $200 to this candidate. I wonder who else they're giving to," you can go back to the contributor section and just plug that person's name in, and that will show you every single check they've made at the state level. And on the federal level, you could do the same thing. Just go fundraising section and individual contributions. And you could plug that same person's name in. You can do the same thing. You can search by candidate to see who's giving to, candidate A or candidate B, or just find each particular contributor. See, anyone have any other any questions? This gets a little trickier because as of a couple of years ago, there was talk of consolidating everything through the Secretary of State's office, which unfortunately has not happened yet. But these were most of at least the bigger counties, the bigger cities, they have all their stuff is online, but it's not always the most user friendly. I'll pull up. So Maricopa County, for example, which will have a bunch of races next year. No, that's not even the right website. See. There you can search, if you're looking for a particular candidate, you can put in their name, a particular political action committee or super PAC. You can just search by office. Say who all is running for county attorney. That'll give you a list of candidates. Click on their name and you have to click on over here, and that's where you'll see the reports. Now, this candidate doesn't have any reports in yet, but that's where they'll show up. They're unfortunately they're not searchable, and unfortunately you can't do things like search by name of contributor or anything like that. City of Phoenix has its own website that's extremely difficult to use. I don't have a lot of experience using any of the other cities, but unfortunately they're not, definitely not as user-friendly as Secretary of State or especially as the FEC. But they're all in different places, and some of them you can't even really get a lot of the information online if it's a smaller town, smaller county. Anyone else?
Are they accountable for things though that have to be filed on?
Yeah, they have the same. The filing deadlines. These are all set by state law, and they all apply to some. Some of the entities will have different election cycles, but you generally have same quarterly reports. You have reports due a certain amount of time before an election and a certain amount of time after election. Everyone has to abide by those, even if you're like Phoenix or Tucson, for example, you have off-year elections. But same rules apply, it's just a lot more difficult in some cases to find the information. All right. No one else has any questions? I guess that'll wrap things up.